Welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. I am your host, Blythe Brumleve, and I'm happy to welcome in Joe Lynch. He is the host of the Logistics of Logistics podcast, and we're going to be talking about the state of podcasting in freight. Drink every time I say the word logistics or podcast in this episode, because it's probably going to be a lot, and maybe don't drink every time we say that, because you might not make it to the end of the show. But Joe, welcome in.
Thank you so much, Blythe. I'm happy to be here. I'm always happy to catch up with you. We were talking before we hit record, and you were saying that, oh my God, we're not going to have enough time if we don't start. So
Yes,
we
exactly.
begin blabbing.
This has happened to me frequently this week, where I start the conversation off and we just get going, and then all of a sudden you realize you haven't hit record yet and you've missed a lot of really good parts of the conversation.
Right,
So
right. And then
I
you
didn't
can't
want that to
recreate
happen
it.
today.
Yeah, you can't recreate it. Yeah, that's that. Well, anyway, I'm happy to be on your podcast, and I have listened to your podcast when you were doing over at Cyberly, and your new one over here at Everything is Logistics.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, obviously, I've been a longtime fan of
Oh,
yours,
thank you.
and you've been really, for folks who may not know, you've really been a pioneer in this space when it comes to this, newish, I guess, to logistics medium, and that is podcasting. But before you got to podcasting, you actually spent quite a bit of time as a writer, as also working in logistics. So for folks who may not be aware of your career background before podcasting, can you kind of give
Right.
us an idea of that?
Yep. So since I've been working a long time, I'll make a bullet point. So I started my career at 19. I went to work for my dad's engineering business, and we were in Michigan, Dearborn, and he did mostly automotive engineering. And I was a draftsman. God, look it up, kids. It's like it was before the CAD systems came. And then I went eventually. My dad had this small company. He had a heart attack. I ended up working and running that company. So my hair started going gray, and we ultimately closed that business, but I stayed in automotive engineering and product development. I got my degrees at night, and it took like 19 years. I don't advise. And I stayed in automotive, kind of moving up through engineering, and then I was a program manager. I launched cars all over the world: China, Thailand, Europe, Mexico. And I traveled. I had a good life. In 2008, 2009, when all the automotive companies went bankrupt, I was doing work with Chrysler. I didn't work there, but I was a supplier, and they went out of business. I shouldn't say Chrysler. They went bankrupt. They didn't pay us, and I lost my job. I was at this little company that I was hoping to buy someday, and suddenly I found myself out of work. And at that time, I couldn't have bought myself a job in automotive. There was nothing to be gotten. And so I got recruited to this little logistics company, and I went to work there, and it was great. They had a TMS. It was off the shelf. I won't say who, but it was great. And I just say this, Blythe, at that time, 2010, as I'm showing potential customers that, they looked at me like I was Steve Jobs. They were like waving people into the room. You should see this. What do you call this, Joe? I go, I call it the transportation management system. But about that time, I also started writing the logistics of logistics as a blog. And my purpose was to get business. And what I quickly noticed is, yes, I have a successful blog followed by my competition, other logistics people. So I had this following. I started the Logistics of Logistics group on LinkedIn, which now has like 215,000 people in it. But
Wow.
it was just writing to gain some notoriety. I will also say this, like, I can never forget what this felt like to be in an industry for many years in automotive and all of a sudden be out and really unable to find a job. When I went to logistics, I took a huge pay cut. And it was a little company, kind of in turnaround mode. I was the COO, general manager. Titles come cheap. But I learned a ton from the founder of that company. We grew triple the size of the company while I was there. And I thought, I'm never going back. I thought I'd be back to automotive after 2 years, but I loved how entrepreneurial this space was, and I loved how it was just wide open. And by the way, there was also, automotive is very mature. Logistics was very immature. It's growing up now. But anyway, I started the podcast 5 years ago. At that time, I had left that little logistics company and I was doing some consulting. I was doing some digital marketing like you kind of do. We've talked about that in the past, and doing some digital marketing. I was doing some sales training. I also advised very large shippers on how to select a 3PL. And right about that time, right before COVID, my executive coach said, by that time I've been podcasting, 2 years. And she said, why don't you make the podcast your main business? And I was like, because I don't make any money on it. How about that, Ann? How's that work? And she goes, well, figure it out. And so I do have some sponsors, and I'm starting to get advertisers. And I'm still dabbling in little consulting. So that's my long blathering story. But I've learned so much, and I've enjoyed it so much over the last 5 years, really seriously over the last 2 or 3 years.
And so it was just a recommendation from your coach to start the podcast. That was the big reason why you started it.
I had started it. There was a guy, I forgot his name now. He was a blogger in logistics. And by the way, he deleted his name is George. He deleted his blog. It got basically hacked. And he invited me on his podcast. And he said, I'm doing a podcast for high school sports in Pennsylvania. We talked about it a lot. And then he cared more about that. And ultimately, he started doing really well on that. But I remember when he said, would you be on my podcast to talk about logistics? I was like, George, what are you doing? Like we're bloggers. We're not doing that. And then I was like, that was easier than writing an article. You know that, Blythe. It's a lot easier to hear blowhards like me talk than to sit down and write.
Yes, and I love that you said that, we're writers. We don't do podcast, because I said the same thing about myself. I'm not in front of the camera. I'm a writer. I will never do that.
At least you look good in front of the camera, Blythe.
You do as well too, and that's and I think
at Manifest, somebody said to me, "You look a lot younger in person in real life," and I was like, "Yeah, but who sees me in real life? God darn it!"
Oh, well, that's well, as we kind of, so you started, before COVID, because I think COVID was kind of the catalyst for a lot of different content marketers in logistics. And that's where you saw, a lot of the networking that, at conferences, where all the conferences were virtual. And so everybody moved to remote. And so you saw this growth, extraordinary growth of just marketers going on LinkedIn and, making live streams and then turning those into podcasts. And I was one of those folks included. I've been a podcaster since 2014, but I never logistics specific until it was around, 2019 is when I started the Digital Dispatch podcast, which is now Everything is Logistics. But what did you make of that first, sort of, I guess, 6 months of like the COVID lockdown and seeing all of these people making content? What were your initial thoughts?
Well, I did know just that a lot of them quit after they do it for a while. And I would also say, every once in a while, somebody will say, well, that other podcaster competes against you. But I never see it that way. I just see it as, first off, I've said this about Freight Waves. They're like the Beatles and the rest of the British invasion kind of following on their coattails. They have long, wide coattails for us to ride, but they created a larger market. When somebody listens to your podcast and they go, oh, okay, I listen to Blythe, and then hopefully they come over to mine or some others, there has to be a market for this. So the bigger the market, the better for everybody. And I would also say there was just some conversation. Dan, the driver on LinkedIn, had said something about what podcast should I be on? And he was saying, what are the stats? Show me the stats. And I was kind of making I made the point that there's like a community that gets built in these, and between other podcasters, but between the audience, and then also even if 1,000 downloads a month is all you have, and those people, and you start to build that relationship, and that's what happens. Relationships happen. Before we hit record, we were talking about Manifest. We were talking about some other stuff. We could have blathered on for an hour just because we've gotten to know each other through podcasting. You've been on my podcast a few times, so I don't know if I answered your question there, but what I made of it was good. Now, I do know that some are not going to last, and that's fine. It is harder than it seems to keep a podcast going. When I was still working on a lot of stuff, I struggled to get my podcasts out.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely I think both of us are lucky in the sense that now it pretty much is our full-time focus. And so we are able
Right.
to allocate that time and that resources, but we're really only able to allocate that time and resources through the support of advertising, sponsorship partners, things like
Right.
that.
And
So
that
for a
means
lot.
listeners.
Yes, and you can't get that unless you have those listeners, unless you start somewhere,
Right.
unless you start building that community like you were talking about. And so I think it's something like 90% of all podcasts never make it past 10 episodes.
I've heard the same thing. And by the way, there was just, I listened to a local, guys who used to be the rock and roll station DJs in the morning, kind of the morning zoo thing that Dooner always talks about. Drew and Mike are the number one podcasters in Michigan. I listen to their podcast. I drove to work listening to them for many years. Then they got older, I should say, and they lost. But they were the number one in the Detroit area. They have a podcast, and they were reading off about. They can say this because they're podcasters. You can't do it if you're on the radio. They were talking about some of the stats, and they said the dumb money's coming out of this because we saw every celebrity get a podcast all of a sudden. And they don't have time. They have other stuff going on. And they aren't content creators. And I will say also, they're used to the idea that I'm the star of the show. If you're interviewing somebody and you think I'm the star of the show, so the interview with you, Blythe, is secondary, that's not necessarily going to make anybody happy. It's not fun to listen to.
Yeah, definitely, especially if you over the last few years with just sort of the changing and sort of I guess the mainstream media and how a lot of these reporters and broadcasters think they are the star of the show and that people will follow them for, their opinions. And it's like, well, maybe to an extent, but you're still the story is about the guest that's coming on the show, not necessarily about you.
Yeah, I think I just try and keep that in mind because I have a big mouth, but I always remind myself that, when somebody says, "Oh, I really like your podcast," I said, it's really my ability to find good people to come on my podcast. And early on, I was asking friends to come on my podcast. You were on my podcast very early, and I remember it was still using not Squadcast like I use now, not like you use, but I was using, I think, Ringer. And I
Oh
remember
gosh.
we were having all these technical problems, and you said you had worked in TV, and you said, "Oh, trust me, this happens every day in TV." And I was like, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed." But it was in the beginning. How do I get anyone to do this? But I was lucky. I don't want to say lucky. I wrote a million articles, as you did. I already had a little bit of a following before I went on the podcast, and I think that can't be underestimated to be able to say, yes, I brought some people with me to the forum.
And so you spent some time, writing, of course, not some time. You spent a lot of time writing,
Way too
and
much time.
and then you start building up your following on different social media channels. What now as you start the podcast, what sort of goes into your editorial and I guess distribution strategies? How are you, I guess, picking the right guests to have on the show? Because that's a challenging thing for
Yeah.
me to do. So I would love to be able to hear and
I'm,
experience a good one.
well, I did not know the right thing to do in the beginning.
Mm.
After a while, I started realizing LinkedIn is your best friend on this because I can look and see how big the company is. So I try not to talk to anybody when they're brand new because they're going to learn so much, and there's also a good chance they're going to go out of business.
Mm.
So I also think I want to talk to companies that are established that can say, here's what we do, here's how we do it. So I'm looking somewhat for established companies, but I also will say, if I see somebody doing really cool technology that I don't know anyone else doing, or I want them on my podcast. I wanted you on my podcast. You were just on. I've referenced it many times since you talked about connecting the digital dots. And I was like, we were both talking about lead coverage and Kara Brown. And I mentioned it when I talked to her that you said most companies don't connect their digital dots. So that was something I wasn't hearing from anyone else. And I thought, Yeah, I don't care how big your company is, if you have a great idea. But anyway, as far as how I pick based on is it something I haven't talked about yet that's interesting? Is it a big company? Of course, if somebody from Maersk wants to be on your podcast, you're like, of course. It's one of the largest companies in the world. They're going to have some cool stuff to say. But so is the small guy who's got a brand new tech that no one's ever heard of, and you go, I would like to talk. You get them when they're brand new, and they'll still talk to you. 5 years later, they might not take your call.
Well, hopefully they will take your call if you were one of the first
Right,
people,
exactly.
to
You
offer
believed
them
in
that
me.
platform. Right. So how do you so I think, for folks who create content, that you kind of eventually, especially in podcasting, you kind of get to this fork in the road. And I faced it when I was in sports, where either you're going to cover the evergreen topics or you're going to cover the breaking news. It's very difficult to do both, because I think you get addicted to those
Mm,
breaking news numbers, but to me, breaking news numbers just don't have the shelf life of evergreen conversations. I want to be able to have a discussion that is still applicable, 6 months from now. How do you sort of, determine what you're going to cover? Is it either news, or is it, more evergreen, or is it kind of both?
I like the evergreen. And what you mean by that evergreen is I didn't do any, there's not one podcast I did called COVID. And people would say, I would like to come on your podcast and talk about COVID. I was like, call Freightwaves. They have a whole podcast about COVID. And God bless them. They've got 15 podcasts. They're always starting a new one, ending an old one, right? And that's a good fit. They are a news, among other things, they're a news company. I like the idea of stories. I think we all connect with stories. It's not necessarily a marketing strategy, but boy, it helps when you go, I talked to Blythe and I love her story. I love her expertise and I want to work with her. And we are irrational beings. When I like your story and I believe you can solve my problem because the way you described my problem, it's a win. So to answer your question, I am much more about the the long term, the evergreen. I like it better.
What about, from the lens of, distribution, where all of these, social media has been around for a decade, but it feels like there's new strategies, there's new tools, there's all kinds of, new platforms. How do you choose where to focus, is to get the message out about the podcast?
Yes, I've done a horrible job on some of this. So right now, I don't have a TikTok, and if I was to look over at Paul at Freight Caviar, he's got a great TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. I don't have Instagram yet. I will. I'll probably get to Instagram. I don't know about TikTok, but I have not gone that way. And I got to tell you, this is a weird thing. It kind of blew my mind, and might not blow yours because you're more focused on the social media. But I heard Pat Flynn, who's kind of an influencer in the space. I think it was him, say, yeah, if you start a podcast, you should also think that that'll be the foundation for your business. The YouTube videos are going to be a big part of it. So is the content strategy for social media and a newsletter. And I was like, and so I was like, well, so you could look right now and say, I do the podcast, and the reason I do the podcast is so I can have a whole bunch of video clips. And some people will listen to the podcast itself. Others are just going to watch the 5-minute video clip. And so things have changed. I did not think anything about this when I started the podcast. Blythe, when I did the first few years of podcast, there was no video. And I would be in a sweatshirt. I didn't shave. I was going to the gym or going for a walk. Now with the video, you're like, oh, I have to worry about my background. I got to still fix my background. That is a challenge. And also, it's even if I get it right, I still have guests who aren't getting it right. So, but anyway, getting back to it, video changed everything. And I do think how you distribute it is really big. And I've not done as good a job. This year, I will improve on some of that stuff.
I'm in the same boat as you. It feels like there's so many different components, and you have to almost know that platform. Not almost, you pretty much have to know that platform
Yes.
inside and out before you even start creating content there. And so I think
Yes.
that's where I struggle with, especially when it comes to YouTube because I do want to capitalize on, the short form video with YouTube Shorts to the long form video. I think there's a lot of promise there. And but there also there's a time and a bandwidth issue that goes on with making a podcast. I mean, my God, I was just talking to before we started recording that I'm talking to 6 people today, and you got to prep for all of them. You got to edit all of them. And then you have to add that additional layer of video onto it. I think video is great for recording, but I haven't cracked the YouTube nut yet. And that is,
I got to
it's
tell
a
you,
struggle.
I got to tell you, if you go on YouTube right now, you'll see our buddy Ramel Watley, Truck and Hustle podcast. I think he has over 100,000
He does.
subscribers on YouTube. He's done a fantastic job on video. And by the way, I create a lot of videos. We put them up on YouTube, but we haven't cracked the SEO and the thumbnails. And when I say cracked, it's basically focused and getting the right people on. And I'm actually doing that because I start to realize that's what some of my sponsors want. It's what my audience wants. And I throw this back out there, like every one of my podcasts and every one of your podcasts, you have to make your audience happy. You have to bring them something that hopefully they get value from. And it's not entertainment. They want to learn something about the business. And then your sponsors, they are all looking, or your advertisers are all looking for favorable attention. And that's why I always say it's a weird juggling act. You can't go full infomercial on it and go, yes, I just did a 30-minute advertisement and my audience hates it, but that's okay because my advertiser likes it. And you said this to me years ago about news stations. I know you've worked in the news before, that watch local news. They have sold their soul to advertisers in some cases.
Yes, and I even like local radio too. It's all driven by the advertiser model, which on the opposite end, it makes it really interesting to see some of these other platforms, like a Substack or even like there's a news show that I watch called Breaking Points. They're completely independently funded,
Yeah,
listener funded.
I've seen that.
And I think that's fascinating. I think that could be a move in my future, is completely being listener funded. It's not the right choice right now because I feel like I'm still building. But
Right.
what are your thoughts on sort of that independent listener route?
I definitely I respect that. I like that. I don't think it's for me, and the reason I think this is think my I really like the idea of helping companies kind of craft their message and getting it out there. But I don't think one has to preclude the other. I also I look at Jordan Peterson. I just saw this. Whether you like him or not, he's built this fantastic media empire, books and video, and he has a Patreon. Like, the dude is making hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, and he has a Patreon. Hey, please support my channel. You're like, oh, okay, good for you, man. Like, an extra 30 grand's gonna help.
I mean, yeah, I guess it's just more of, having different lines in the water and, the different revenue streams maybe in case, especially in his case where he could get shut down, I think, at any moment.
Yes. Yeah, anybody political can. I was at my mom's house, and my mom had Drew Barrymore show on, and I've always liked Drew Barrymore. And Drew Barrymore was like, oh my God, I had such a great weekend, blah, blah, blah. I had some friends over, and we decided we were going to play some games. And I just bought this new game, and all of a sudden the back of her background turns to this game, and it turns into this infomercial with Drew Barrymore talking about this game that she loved. But it felt like, Drew, you would have just been so much better off saying, hey, I got a great new advertiser, as opposed to like taking us through this fraud. Like, I hate that. And I feel like that's so stupid. And we all have sponsors. We have those people. And I always say, everybody who's on my podcast, whether they're a paid sponsor or not, I want them to get business.
Mm-hmm.
They took time to help me with my content. My audience wanted to learn something from them. I want them to show up good. And you probably get this too, like everyone's like, you're not going to ask any like gotcha questions. You're like, why would I? Like,
Yeah.
what's in it for me? Like, not an investigative reporter. I'm not.
Right. And that's I actually I tweeted this out recently because a PR rep who shall go unnamed wanted me to send over a very detailed list of questions for the
Hmm.
guest that was coming on, their client that was coming on my show. And I said, no, here's a brief overview. So I didn't say
Right.
outright no. I just said, here's an overview of the discussion. She said, okay, great. Can you send over the specific questions you're going to be asking? And I was like, this is not a dissertation. It's a conversation. And I think that that's where most folks get it
Gotta be,
wrong is they treat it like breaking news. They don't treat it like a conversation.
let me throw this out there to you, and perhaps you've seen the same thing I did. When I was a blogger, I was still the general manager and COO of a logistics company, and I would put that in the bottom. I said, this is the way we do it, blah blah blah. I would kind of say I am the general manager COO of a logistics company. So I I was not trying to imply that I'm a neutral third party. And then I started doing a lot of webinars on how to select a 3PL. Was I honest and open about that? Yes. But I did also say, I manage a 3PL. I'm in this business. Now I did get some work that way. But what I felt happen a little bit in blogging is as soon as marketing heard there's a blog, can we get part of that? And then they started saying, hey, rather than that title, how about this title? And I used the term fluff and stuff, and I heard that from my friend Jody over at DAT. And she said fluff and stuff is what some marketers do. And all of a sudden it ends going from something that it felt authentic and real to this jargon-filled title. And then, hey, rather than say this, how about you say this? And you're all of a sudden it turns it salesy. The same thing I feel can happen to podcasts. You have sponsors, you have advertisers, but really coming on super salesy, super strong doesn't help you. I say it this way: you're already on the date. You don't it's like you're here. You're here. You don't need to sell. And I've said this to you before we hit record. If 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 at the end of my podcast, the guest, my audience knows, likes, and trusts my guest, relates to them on some level, that's a huge win. If they also say, I see that person as the solution to the problem that I have, that's just win. That's all win. And if and so I this is the medium that your personality can come through, your story can come through, and we connect with that.
So so when you get a guest on that comes on the show and they maybe get a little too salesy, how do you sort of navigate the I guess the complexity of that conversation?
Yeah, I always say that what how to make a bad podcast, and I've made plenty of bad podcasts. How to make a bad podcast is to be salesy, to be use a whole bunch of tech jargon like everybody understands it, to be monotone, right? Um, those things are what. And by the way, the monotone thing, I kind of feel like we all match the host's energy. So I've done podcasts where some like founders like, I can do it at 7 o'clock at night. And I was like, yeah, you might be able to, but I will be low energy and then you'll match my energy and it'll suck. So anyway, how do I manage when somebody's overly salesy? I don't know that I necessarily do, but I always say, if it's a conversation like we're having now, I don't ever feel like the need to say, yeah, and by the way, Blythe, the logistics of logistics, because whatever I say after that, people go, oh, I don't like that guy. He's selling. We, in the West, that's like fingernails on a chalkboard. When you hear somebody start selling, your defenses go up. You're like, remember the door-to-door guys who would say, so what's your name, Blythe? Oh, Blythe, that's great. I love that name. That's my mom's name or whatever. And then when they say something like, Blythe, can you see how this might be of value to you and your family? You go, get out. Like, we hate that. And so
I think we're just so, as Americans, we're so conditioned to seeing commercials with everything that we almost kind of ignore them. So I think, when folks come on and they, to your point, and they're too salesy, you're just immediately going to tune out the conversation, maybe switch to the show. So it's in the guest's best interest to not
right.
be so pushy in, just a traditional conversation setting.
I think what's also interesting, and I'm sure you have the same experience, when you have a guest who comes on, and there's a lot of founders, a lot of executives, innovators who are very humble, and they have failed more times than they've succeeded, and they're happy to share those failures. And you go, oh, this guy's real. Before he was on my podcast, I just thought this is the king of the universe, and he's made all this money, or she's made all this money. And then you get to talking to him, and they're like, oh, that company went out of business. I got fired. This happened. This happened. You go, oh, I relate. We all can relate to this. What you can't relate to is the guy or the gal who, at 19, I started a company and I never looked back, and I've killed it. But humility goes a long way. Being real goes a long way. I don't care how well you've done in your business. We all go home to challenges at home, whatever they might be. And if you've got teenagers, you're never the boss.
Which my parents would definitely have agreed, all those years ago when I was a teenager. Now,
Yeah.
Joe, do you have a few favorite conversations that you've ever had?
Oh my God, I've really had I've had so many, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on your show. I've referenced connecting the digital dots, which I had a conversation with you, I don't know, a few months ago. I love that. Recent ones, I haven't even published them yet. I did an interview with Ashley Thomas. She's driver recruiting, and they're making a movie about her life. She was
Cool.
yeah, you should have to have her on your podcast. She had this horrible upbringing when she was young. I'll let her tell that story. She was great on my podcast just because she came from nowhere and made a really successful company. I just talked to Paul Jarrett. He's the founder of Bulu Group, him and his wife out in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it's funny, when I started talking to him, he said, I'm a proud product of the Shamrock Trailer Park in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he has killed it. Him and his wife have really done a great job over there. So those are just, I haven't even published those ones yet, but I have, I loved interviewing Oren Zaslansky from Flock Freight. I've interviewed Andrew and Michael from Leto from Emerge. I mean, those
Yes.
guys, that they have kind of revolutionized this industry. I interviewed Doug Wagner, CEO of, and by the way, when you're interviewing Doug Wagner, he's the CEO over at Echo Global Logistics. I was like intimidated. Like, this he grew a company from 60 million to 4.5 billion in sales in 16 years. But he is humble and thoughtful. I've never had too much of anybody treat me anything less than cordially and like a friend. So I feel this is the coolest. I've said this before. I would do my podcast if no one listened, because I have interviewed 350 people who many have become good friends.
I think that is unique to podcasting, where you can, because you're sitting in front of a camera, of course, but you're having these really heartfelt conversations about someone's life and what got them to the place that they are today. And so that's an intimate conversation. And it's
Right.
also, I think podcasting itself is just such an intimate experience, because you're in someone's ear. You're in someone's ear while they're driving to work, while they're taking their kids to school, while you're cleaning the house. And that's just unique to that medium.
I think there's also another aspect of it is you do podcasts all the time, so do I, so you kind of get used to doing them. But for a lot of people, even if they're very successful in their business, they don't do a lot of them, or maybe they're introverted, they don't even feel that comfortable doing it. When you're kind of guiding them through, and at the end when they go, "Oh, I think I came off really good," that is a really you can almost not have done a bigger favor to somebody. And I think people really appreciate, like, "Oh my God, Blythe made me sound like I'm really smart." But when you're talking to people about the stuff they are expert in, they are really smart. And I think people are so used to remember we learned public speaking in elementary school, read this book and then stand up in front of the class and talk about it. And you're like, all right, well, I'm going to try and read some of the book, and then I'm going to try and wing it. and I will get over the embarrassment of not knowing. Well, we don't have to do that in our business lives, because we are hopefully pretty much expert in the stuff we do.
And I think too, you hit the nail on the head for a lot of these different conversations because we're almost the people who are passing the alley oop to
Yeah.
the founders and the people who can dunk it into the basket. That's
Right.
that I think that's the goal of any good podcast host. So for companies who, maybe they started up a podcast, in 2020 and maybe they let it get a little dormant or they're thinking about starting a podcast, what would be some tips that you would give to folks who are just, interested in dipping their toe in the podcast water?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to meet people. Again, I think it's a great way to build relationships. And, you know, a lot of my sponsors, I suspect some of your sponsors and advertisers come because they were on your podcast and they like the experience. So they get to know you and go, I'd like to work with Blythe. I'd like to work with Joe. So that is a great way to build relationships. As far as my advice on it, I think you have to kind of experiment and figure out what actually works because every once in a while, I listen to some podcasts that I go, oh, they don't have the production quality right. They didn't want to spend on that. And maybe the host, you got to do a lot of these before you're any good. You came from a background in broadcasting, so you're good at it. I feel like you said this to me about when I first started my podcast. I said I can't listen, and you go, "Oh yeah, I was that way when I was on the sports on TV. Couldn't watch, couldn't listen." I felt that way for months. And I remember somebody said, "I really like your podcast," and I was like, "Shut up, shut up." So it takes time to get proficient. So you have to kind of get past that. And I would also say you really need to figure out what the right topic is because if your goal is we're a logistics company, we're just going to interview shippers, you better figure out an angle that makes sense for them because they're like, well, what's in it for me? Why should I go on your podcast, right? And also, you have to watch it becoming salesy because that's the nature of it. It comes from marketing. It comes from, and I'm a sales guy. We're all salespeople, but we have to just tone it down in that. And I would also say this. I'll throw this out there. Who knows what the future brings? But I do think we're going to end up with more cooperation and more overlap in how these work because it makes sense. Because not everybody should have to have a podcast. I mean, if you want one and it's working, great, but you shouldn't have to have one just because just like blogs. When I was doing website development, everyone would say, "Yeah, we want to have a blog," and I would always say, "Why don't we hold off until you actually give me all the content for the website because you don't want to write that, yet you think you want to blog once a week." You know what torture that is.
Because it's really the time dedication to it, and I've kind of come around on this because for a while I was trying to teach everybody about the value of podcasting and that
Mm-hmm.
you should start one, and it's a great way to meet your customers. It's a great way to interview your customers and develop that product roadmap and yada yada yada. Just singing the praises of podcasting, which I still sing today, but it is very challenging to find a host that is a founder that can be the voice of your company because you don't want them to leave and then the voice of your
Right.
company leaves. And so being able to have someone that has the time and the dedication and the talent in order to dedicate to a craft that they are not going to be good
Right.
at first, they're going to have to figure out a lot of things
Right.
along the way. And are you still going to do it after all of those challenges?
Right. And by the way, just before COVID, I was traveling some, and I remember having to come home on Friday and do a podcast or two, and just be like, I'm jet lagged, and just like I don't want to do it. And that's the nature of being a founder. So like finding the time or finding someone, there's some challenges. That's why I think there's going to be more cooperation where you're like maybe you're working with a number of brands, and I'm working with some brands, and just because it makes sense.
So, what does a typical week look like for you?
So I publish 3 podcasts a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So that is always got my attention. And then I'm always trying to create more content. So I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, kind of looking at people. Now I've been asking lately on my podcast. I like to interview smart, interesting people like you, Blythe. Who else should I interview? So that's kind of got me networking with a lot of people, which is fun. And get to meet people I might not otherwise have met. But I do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, a lot of time checking my podcasts. I do spend some time trying to reach out to my existing sponsors and advertisers and kind of reaching out to other ones. I'm trying to spend all day Tuesday doing that. I've never really focused that much on that, but as I realized I might want to hire like full-time video people, I'm like, okay, somebody's
Right.
going to pay unless somebody
The
drops.
same boat.
Unless I win the lottery, I guess I better go get some more sponsors, more advertisers. Treat this like a business. By the way, what I did for a long time is I put my head down and said, I'm going to get really good at this. And that's it. I'll get sponsors as they come, but I didn't have a sales effort. And now I'm doing more of that.
So as you're developing your sales effort, what about, for the companies who, maybe starting a podcast is probably not right for them. So they would rather just invest in a podcast that is already, that you don't have to worry about any
Right.
of those warning signs that we just kind of laid out. So what advice would you give, I guess, maybe to companies who would want to become a sponsor of, say,
Right.
the logistics of logistics?
Well, like I have sponsors and they come on my podcast like once a quarter, and I interview somebody from the company, and we talk about what they do and how they do it. And once a quarter, hopefully, doesn't feel like it's an infomercial at that point. I also am careful about sponsors. I don't ever want to have to bring a sponsor on that I feel doesn't bring something new to the party, right? And I listen to other podcasts, and every once in a while you hear an advertiser. Now, this is not a logistics thing. This is often separate from logistics. And you go, I would never have that as a sponsor. Just because if you listen to a lot of sponsorships, it's like they've got their whole network has the same sponsor. So I would say, getting back to answer your question, I would say collaborate with if you're a company that doesn't want to have your own podcast, I think there's some real value. There is social proof by being on your podcast or being on my podcast that you're there, right? And that's not just ours, the Freight Waves and Chris Jolly and Ramel we mentioned, so many others. I would say it makes sense because you're going to have an audience, they're going to have the expertise, they're going to have the production, and you don't want to have to do that. Now, wrong way to say it. If you choose not to do that, then go ahead. You can still do lots of podcasts with all the people I just mentioned and not have to invest. And I think the biggest worry, you already brought it up, is I hired a person to do the podcast and then they left. And now what?
And two, as far as like the production quality too, because I think for especially, as someone that worked in radio for years, it was so easy just to show up and just be a part of the show. But when you have to start doing it yourself, and the only reason I started doing it myself was because I wanted more airtime on the radio and they wouldn't give it to me the way I wanted it. And so I was like, well, I'll just start doing my own thing. And I started doing my own thing. I was like, wow, this is actually pretty difficult. You got to get all the equipment. You got to, make sure that you're tech savvy. You got to get it, not just the show planning, but the equipment, the recording, the editing, the uploading, the distribute. It's so much to it. So to your point, it really is, there is a full workload of items that you may not know that you realize. So you can still start small and enter the game with, just a really cheap microphone and, an iPhone. You can get started that way, of course, but having that dedication to improve those little aspects of all of those different important parts of podcasting is really important to continuously improve on, because otherwise people aren't going to stick with you for very long.
Yeah, I've noticed, and it's kind of shocking, bad audio quality. And by the way, I have also launched stuff with poor audio quality, usually because of a bad connection with somebody, because I'm doing remote like this today. It sucks. And you don't think it matters until you're listening to good podcasts and you switch to one and you go, what's going on over there? Why am I hearing all this noise? So there's some value in partnering up with, existing players who have an audience. The production quality is there, and it just works better. I mean, we're seeing that. That's why people come to me. And by the way, I should also say this: I don't edit anything myself. I have Natalie who works with me. She is actually works with one of my sponsors, Lean Solutions Group, and it's just so much easier for me not to have to do the editing because it's hard enough to get 3 podcasts a week out.
Oh God, I only do 2 a week, and so you're already like a machine, like putting 3 episodes
Well,
out a
again,
week because
that you can thank Natalie because you do the actual touching of the audio file. I can't fix that.
well, I used to, so it was important for me, especially early
In the
on,
beginning, I
to
know you
know
did, yeah.
how to do it because in case of an emergency or even in last minute situations where there is something that I really want to cover and I want to get it out, sooner than my podcast editor will be able to tackle it. He is typically pretty good at tackling editing shows within 48 hours of recording them. But sometimes it's immediate. I need to get it out like today. So what's the famous line? Like, I know enough to be dangerous, but I trust that I think that's the biggest thing as sort of a founder, as a podcaster, is being able to trust that someone else can do that for you. And I think that that's a big step for every business owner that they have to make. And that's essentially what you're doing as a podcaster. You're running
Yeah.
a business and you
Yeah.
have to be able to trust other people to care as much as you do.
Yeah, and I'll throw this out there. We talked a little bit about YouTube. I feel like we see this convergence between YouTube and podcasting. So all of us who started as podcasters, like myself, have slowly but surely creating more and more video clips. And I feel like when I look at big companies in our space, some of whom are my sponsors, many of them haven't invested in YouTube yet. But I feel like when it happens, we're going to find every billion-dollar company is going to basically have their own network on YouTube. And so I feel like it's still early. As much as I watch YouTube more than I watch anything else, but we're still early in all this. And I think what we need to start thinking of the podcast is not just audio. Some people will listen to the podcast while working out or going for a walk or going to the grocery store. But there's other people are going to watch video stuff online, and we're going to get more and more sophisticated there.
I echo that. YouTube is such an integral part of just my viewing habits every day. And if a podcast has a video option, I will watch that. Even if it's just 2, like we're doing here, 2 talking heads. Even if it's just that, I'd like to see people's faces and their mannerisms when they're speaking.
Yep. And by the way, a friend of mine pointed this out to me not so long ago. He said, your videos, no one will watch 50 minutes of an interview on YouTube. I said, why not? And he goes, there's only one camera angle for each face. He says, with the stuff we watch has multiple camera angles and it cuts every second. And he goes, it's visual. And he goes, you can watch a 5-minute or a 10-minute video if you're interested in the topic. He said, but you won't watch an hour. And I was like, interesting. So Joe Rogan's a perfect example. He got a little more production quality now. But before that, it's hard to watch unless you're cleaning the house and it's in the background.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you want to do it not just for the sake of doing it, but you also want to do it right. And I think that's kind of where my conflict is with YouTube is that, I have uploaded videos that are just kind of like this, two talking heads that are speaking for an hour. Would I like to make more YouTube friendly videos? Of course. But it's also a bandwidth issue and it's also a resources issue. So how do we get that next sponsorship in order to sponsor the YouTube, to sponsor the newsletter? Because then that helps creators like us, be able to justify that extra time, to be able to hire someone to handle, the editing portions of it or the uploading portions of it. And you do the things that you do best, and then you hire other people that can do the things that they do best. Now, Joe, which I guess podcasts or YouTube channels or maybe both bring you regular inspiration that you find yourself watching and listening to?
Well, I do like Drew and Mike. They're in Michigan, but so many people from Michigan spread out like everywhere else. So they were always on the radio. So I listen to them. They're on 4 days a week, 5 days a week. So I like them. And I listen to them just before I'm going to bed. I sometimes fall asleep listening. that's kind of gives me some Detroit flavor stuff, right? Because I don't listen to the radio. I watch Peter Zion. That's Zeihan. He is a geopolitical guy.
I have his book right here. Right. Yeah.
I love his book. So his
The
book,
end of the world is just the beginning.
Yep, and the end of the world is just the beginning is mind expanding. I mean, I can't believe how good that book is. Yesterday, I talked to a guy from the Nearshore Company, and we talked about that at great length. But basically, Peter Zion is a geopolitical guy. He has a YouTube channel. Every day at lunch, I watch him wherever he's at in the world, and he's in New Zealand today. And it's like a 3-minute video. He talked about TikTok today. And he talked about how TikTok is going to be banned and it should be banned. And that was interesting to me because he's usually pretty much a laissez-faire, yeah, guy. He's even said that better than I did on the YouTube. But he did like a 3-minute video. But he talks a lot about the changing trade patterns. So we're going to do less with China. Us supply chain guys need to know that. We're going to do more with Latin America. We need to know that. So I love Peter Zion. I love. I've every once in a while watch Joe Rogan. And by the way, I don't ever look at him as like a political guy at all. He's just a guy. And by the way, I know people.
His guests are phenomenal.
He also does. He would always say, "I'm just a dumbass comedian who smokes dope." I don't know, but by the way, he always says, "I was going to vote for Bernie Sanders." I'm not necessarily. I would not vote for Bernie Sanders. He's not my guy. But I guess I don't care because he's just such a regular guy. But he became kind of a lightning rod. But I think anyone who thinks he's real political isn't watching. So I've enjoyed, not
Agreed.
always. I've enjoyed a lot of his stuff. Who else? I like Megyn Kelly's got a podcast I listen to sometimes. Again, she's more of a middle of the road news person, which I like. You mentioned that Crystal and Sagar.
Yes, I love them. Breaking Points.
Breaking Points. They have he's from the right, she's from the left. I like that. I like, you know what I always say is, I want politics and news to be boring again. It used to just be boring, and I just waited. Hurry up, get to the sports and weather. Like, I want it back in that box.
And that's unfortunately, I don't think it's ever going to be back in that box because you see, you just mentioned Megyn Kelly. Like you see some of these bigger name broadcasters. Jon Stewart is another one that have left their traditional roles and started up their own shows.
I will say I've listened to Bill Maher. I've enjoyed his stuff. He's a funny comedian. And Jon Stewart, of course, you mentioned. So I love watching some of these short clips from some of these guys. And I don't always listen to their podcasts. Some I listen to the podcast, but sometimes it's really easy to commit to a 10-minute video online where you're like, that's Jon Stewart, he's funny. That's Bill Maher, he's funny. That's Joe Rogan, I like this guest.
And then before you know it, you've watched 7 of their clips from the same show, and it kind of goes against the grain of the argument that the gentleman was making earlier, that no one's going to sit and watch a 50-minute interview. Well, they might watch 5 clips in a row, and that's pretty close to 50 minutes.
Yes, I think there's so much great content out there. I was talking to Ramel Watley, and I said I love My First Million podcast because
yes, that's a great show.
And so I've listened to that one a lot. I'm trying to think who else I listen to.
What about in the industry? Anybody in logistics that's making great content?
Oh, I listen to your stuff every once in a while. I've listened to Ramel's. I try and so when you're coming on my podcast, I listen. Ramel Watley's got a different audience than I do, but it's interesting to listen because I say this more on my podcast now. This whole industry talks about tech and this, that, the other thing, but it's built on the back of truck drivers and warehouse workers and dock workers, and no one wants to do that job. We have to make those jobs better, and so I like listening to Ramel's because it feels like it's very much ground level, and he's got a huge audience. He's done really well over there. And I met him and his wife at Manifest. Well, I was talking to you, I think, when he walked up.
Yeah, well, I only saw him in passing because he is one of those bucket list people that I've had him on the show a couple times, but he it almost feels like he's not getting enough attention that he deserves, because
Yeah.
he is doing it on just an upper echelon level. For folks who may not know, Ramel is the founder and CEO of Truck and Hustle, and he has amazing content that comes out, as you were just talking about,
Right.
from folks who are in the trenches,
He's
entrepreneurs.
got video angles, different cameras.
Yes.
Like I was like,
He
hallelujah.
travels with a video crew to different conferences, and
All his interviews are live. He doesn't do them
yes.
remote. Like I
And
will
he'll
do
fly in to the company location and do the interview on site. And I just think that that is such a I don't know that anybody else in our industry, or really just podcasters in general, that are doing that at that level. So shout out to him for really setting the standard of where,
yes,
and
yes.
making the rest of us feel like, oh crap, we're not working hard enough.
Right. I always say though is there's when I start listening to him, I realize he's talking to the guy who started with one truck and bought two or three. I typically haven't talked to those guys in my podcast, not because they're not important. That was not where I started. I kind of always wanted to talk about freight tech, but I have had drivers on my podcast, and I do like having people who are closer to the ground who give you the reality. And when I went to Manifest, I love being at Manifest because I talk to all sorts of people, and that's a little shot of reality because I get the sense, oh, everything's working out this way in our business. Well, then you talk to shippers and they're saying, no, not exactly. We do this manually. We do that. Oh, doesn't AI do that? Doesn't machine learning somehow do that? I don't know how. Isn't an API or something?
You mention
Maybe?
all of those phrases to a truck driver, and you'll probably get hit over the head with a chair, because they don't want any of that, sort of, big government, privacy concerns, ELDs. They don't want any of that. And
Yeah.
they just want to be able to do their job skillfully, like they've done for so many years.
Right.
And it's important to hear those stories too.
Yeah, and I will say I do like listening to other podcasts out there, but God, when you publish 3 a week, that means I'm listening to mine 3 hours a week. Plus, I'm doing three
You're
or four.
sick of logistics by that point.
Yeah, and what else? I also feel this way sometimes is I never want to copy because I know I've listened to your podcast. I'm not you. I can't be you. I'm not going to try to. Same with Dooner. I listened to Tim Dooner's podcast, and I remember thinking, "Whoops, I'm sorry. That's an amateur mistake."
Oh, you're good.
I
We
listened
are
to
a
that-
little over, so
Yeah, I listen to these podcasts and go, yeah, okay, listen to it, but don't take it to heart. Don't all of a sudden. I can only be the second best Blythe Brumleve. That's
Stop.
the problem. No, but I guess if I start copying you,
Oh,
I'm
true,
never
true.
going to be you.
Exactly.
So you kind of have to play your own game.
Yes. And I think that that's so important for creators to remember, because it really is easy to see. And I fell into this trap when I was working in sports broadcasting, is that I saw what other companies were doing, and they were getting all this attention and accolades. And it's tough to not want to do those things in order to get those same accolades. So I was very intentional about, when I started this show, about the things I would talk about, the format I would have. And I think you still have to constantly remind yourself, when you see other podcasters, maybe getting a little bit more, attention, whether it's in this industry or outside of this industry, you really have to remind yourself of that. And I think, obviously you are I think you and Ramel are really at the top of the podcasting game in this space.
Thank you for saying that, but I really do have to remind myself of this. It's ultimately can't be judged that easily. Can't just judge it by downloads, because FreightWaves has created this massive community, and you kind of that matters. I feel like I know certain podcasts. I saw Tim Dooner for the first time at Manifest, and I felt like we were old friends. And also there's these communities. You're building one yourself, so you know how that is. There's relationships and engagements. So I could have 1 million downloads, and then, by the way, this happened with my group on LinkedIn. It's got 215,000 people in it. I remember when it had 20,000 people in it, and I felt like I knew everybody. Now it's 215,000. People go, wow, that's a huge group on LinkedIn. Is it as same with engagement? No, because there's different languages. There's people selling Mercedes from Qatar in there. I have to constantly delete people out. I would have had tears in my eyes to kick someone out of that group 10 years ago. Now I'm like, So I guess my point is I don't like to focus on numbers because one day the numbers are saying you're great. The next day they say you suck. It's the relationship, the engagement, the communities that we involve with. And that all sounds so hokey, but it's the truth.
And I think that that's sort of it signals to your sort of north star for your show and why you continuously improve on it and get great guests and really to go back to like talking about shows that I listen to your show all the time.
Oh, well, thank
And
you.
I find that when I'm trying to do research on a guest that I'm going to talk to, I'll do a search in YouTube and you'll be the result that pops up. And you have single-handedly saved my research process
By
for
the
a
way,
lot of different interviews I've done.
I saw a founder at Manifest, and he said, I was on your podcast, and he goes, and everybody I've interviewed since for a job has listened to that podcast. And my
That's
friend,
awesome.
And he said, so I kind of like, did you listen to the podcast? Yes, I did. and by the way, my friend Chana from Rabat, he was on my podcast when they were still small, and they're killing it over at Rabat. They are the king of the backstation. And Chana said, I did a podcast interview with him. He worked at six warehousing companies in 3 months. As a founder, he wanted to understand how these warehouses worked. And he said, I put that podcast in my signature line on my email, and he goes, people always ask me about it. So I always think, yeah, this can work. This can work.
What a marketing ploy too, or play is to get the guest to link to the episode in their email signature. That is fantastic.
Make everybody do that.
Yes, everybody should do that right now.
When you're not listening to this podcast, you should be fixing your email address. But yeah, it's this. I really do feel this way. I have a really cool job. You have a really cool job. Talking to people every day who are really getting after it. They say you become the average of the 6 people you talk to. Well, look who we talk to. Like, we are talking to people who are killing it. And that's not just founders. I talk to lots of people who are killing it in other ways. They're not necessarily, not everyone has to be worth a ton of money to be having a big impact. And I love what I do just because of the people.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to sort of put a pin in this discussion, because I feel like we could literally keep on talking for hours and hours. So Joe, where, obviously, if you know of this podcast and you're listening to this podcast, you probably know about Joe's podcast. But for the sake of it, this is what did you refer to this? This is the kiss at the end of the date, and you don't want to do it at the beginning. You want to do it at the end. So
no,
I
was always saying, plug your company at the end. It's like the goodnight kiss. If you plug it in the beginning, it's like the goodnight kiss at the beginning of the date. Weird and awkward, right? You might have ended the date. Do it at the end, and it'd be like, okay, it's maybe more appropriate. But yeah, you can check us out at the Logistics of Logistics. We're on all the podcasting platforms. By the way, Blythe, if it's okay with you, I'll just post this. This will be one of my podcasts also for next week.
Yes, absolutely.
So you might be listening to this on the Logistics of Logistics. If you are, thank you so much.
Heck yeah, likewise. And I think that, obviously you bring a ton of value to this space, to logistics in general. So I think you deserve all of the flowers. So with all that said, we will link to all of your social channels within the show notes, just to make it easy for folks to check out. If you haven't already, I imagine you have, but just in case, we could all use a few more listeners in our respective podcasts. So thank you again, Joe. This was awesome. We're going to do it again in the future, because I waited entirely too long to have you on the show. So this is going to be a regular thing. I hope so anyways.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Blythe. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Likewise.
Let's do it again soon.
Heck yeah.